It's time to make a mountain out of a molehill, everybody. Or, in this case, a Warhammer unit out of a single paragraph from a single short story. See, 40k has this habit of coming up with unique characters, units, and even entire chapters or factions for very specific purposes. If there's something that an author feels is necessary, they usually just kind of make something up. And luckily, 40k is a large enough and flexible enough world that it usually doesn't detract. I mean, what's another Ultramarine successor among friends, am I right? But sometimes these one-off characters, units, and factions end up becoming fan favorites even as they're left behind in the source material they were made for. And that is indeed the case with the Blood Angels' spookiest subspecies of Sanguinary Guard. Welcome to Gone Hollow Minis, my name is Colt, and today we are tracking down the Erelim of the 9th Legion. Okay, first things first, go ahead and skip to here if you're just here to see me kitbash something. No hard feelings, that's what the timestamp is there for. But if you're still here, why don't we get down to business tracking down what the Erelim actually are. To some degree, this is pretty easy. The entire breadth of their lore is contained within one paragraph of the Gabriel Seth the Flesh Terror short story. I thought the Flesh Terror was Nasir Amit from like the 31st millennium, but hey, what do I know? Anyway, in this story, we see Gabriel Seth confronting Astorath the Grim of the Blood Angels for killing a Flesh Terror that had fallen to the Black Rage, which is something that the Flesh Terrors usually don't like to do. Regardless, as Gabriel Seth approaches the doors to Astorath's chambers, he describes this. Seth took a step forward and stopped, his eyes drawn to movement on the nearest statue. Perched between the rivets of its pauldron were a choir of Erelim, the 5 Blood Angel chaplains crouched in shadow, stalking him as he closed in the reclusiasm. Stripped of all insignia and adornment save the chapter symbol emblazoned on their shoulders, they were as dark mirrors to the Sanguinary Guard that stood in the light of Dante. Even their skull helms had been daubed death black, and their jump packs had been framed by halos of darkest feather. Nothing but the glower of their crimson optics betrayed them in their half-light. Okay, what do we actually get here? Namely, of course, we get a physical description. They are the honor guards of the Blood Angels High Chaplain, and their armor is kind of a mix between that of a chaplain and that of the regular Sanguinary Guard. It's described as all black, devoid of the typical adornments that Blood Angels so love. They still have the typical skull mask of a chaplain, however, it's all been painted black instead of the usual bone color. Additionally, they have winged jetpacks, just like Sanguinary Guard should, and uniquely, Seth mentions how both of their pauldrons have the Blood Angels chapter symbol on them, instead of just one. Problem is, that's about it. I can't find a single reference to them in any other Warhammer community article, codex, or any other book, no matter how obscure. The only other reference to Erelim as a word I can find in 40k is in reference to the Angel's Tears of the Horus Heresy, which are kind of the close-range, devastating weapon destroyer squad unit equivalent, at least as far as unique units go for the Blood Angels. Just because the word is the same doesn't mean the unit's the same. There aren't any ties to the Angel's Tears in the chaplaincy, and by the 41st millennium, the Angel's Tears as they were known in Horus Heresy don't even exist anymore. And once you kind of know about them, their absence is a little bit noticeable. I mean, Astorath got his own short story since then, and I couldn't even find a mention of them there. So what, did they all croak in the devastation of Baal? Did Astorath just leave them on a planet somewhere like a pair of lost forgotten car keys? I don't think we'll ever know. And on top of that, there are other left out details that are kind of noticeable too. Seth describes 5 of them, which is a pretty specific number and makes me think that that might be all that there is. But at the same time, he describes them as a choir of Erelim, not the choir of Erelim or just the Erelim. Which makes me think that there are more than these 5, but I don't know where the others are or how many of them there are. It's not a huge detail to miss out on, I know, but with how sparse the description already is, it makes it go from seeming mysterious and vague to just being vague. But regardless, just because they've been left behind in the lore doesn't mean that we have to leave them behind on the tabletop. So let's get to kit bashing. Okay, so again, the base kit here is the Sanguinary Guard. These are naturally a little bit more decorated than the Erelim are supposed to be. Some of these bits we can just leave off, but others, like the little loincloth thing and a couple belt pouches, are kinda sculpted on there. Personally, I don't mind, and I plan on leaving these bits on my models. They still don't look too flashy, and I think including a bit more of the red accent color would help these guys appear a bit more interesting at a tabletop distance. But now this is where I'm going to stop for a second. I've got the torso and legs built, so now we've got a few decisions to make. Firstly, the jump pack. You could absolutely kitbash some wings onto these bad boys, but I am personally saving all of my Sanguinary Guard jump packs for the eventual Vanguard Veteran refresh. Hopefully. Please, Games Workshop. But anyway, I got some printed bits that kind of fit the vibe I'm going for. I'll permanently attach these later, but for now I'm just going to shave down the registration lip that's supposed to keep the plastic packs in place. The next thing we can work on is the helmet. Seth describes them as having skull helms, which makes me think of the standard chaplain helmets. However, these aren't just chaplains, they're the honor guard of chaplains, so let's do something a little bit more special. I'm going to take one of my spare Reaver heads, the essential way to get skull-faced helmets nowadays, and I'm going to make some modifications to it. I actually like those little cheek rebreather things, so I'm going to leave those, but they wouldn't be too hard to remove if you just want a skull. Now I'm going to add a iron halo-y bit like you see on a lot of the older Sanguinary Guard heads. I don't have any of those knocking around though, so we're going to have to get a little bit creative. This is a backpack topper from the Inner Circle Companions kit, and hey, would you look at that? That looks like an iron halo. After a bit of very careful trimming, I've got the halo separated from the little incense burner bit. Make sure to leave some of the little posts that hold the iron halo to the incense burner. These will help add a bit of space between our halo and our helmet. To get this onto my helmet, it just took a little bit of clipping and sanding until the little posts more or less meet my helmet. After that, it just takes a little bit of plastic cement and our converted Erelim head is ready to go. Now, I'm sure you could probably find a third-party helmet that gives you a lot of the similar vibes, but recently I've come to understand the value of consistency in my kit bashing instead of just aesthetics, if that makes sense. You can pour a ton of work into kit bashing and making unique characters, units, and models, but when you put them all on the tabletop, it kind of makes your army look like a gaggle of theater kids that all think they're the main character. Recently, I found that using GW parts in more interesting ways, like this backpack topper transplant, helps to give your details the detail that you want while keeping the art style consistent. But now onto the weapons and arms. You might have noticed that the short story segment doesn't actually mention what these guys use. They're described as chaplains, so they could use a Crozius, but that seems a little pedestrian. But luckily, we have one more lead. See, on top of the kind of codex illustration piece of artwork that I've been using, there is at least one more piece of fan art for the Erelim. This one done by Mikita Vasilchuk. I am so terribly sorry for my horribly American pronunciation of your name. And in this image, we can see the Erelim wielding an axe, likely an emulation of Astorath, their charge. He himself uses the Executioner's axe, and very creative naming conventions aside, I actually agree with the vibe here. The Sanguinary Guard only get spears and swords now, they've lost their axes, so giving these guys axes might make them a little bit more distinct on tabletop as well. Axes are also not the hardest thing to come by either, at least outside of the Blood Angel's range. Here I've got an assortment of my own bits from across Warhammer settings. We've got Chaos axes, Stormcast axes, and even a couple from 40k. You might recognize this one from my video on kit bashing my own Reavers. Don't ask what happened to the rest of the mini. But that axe is actually the one that I'm going to use here. I'm just going to trim it off at the head to get it ready to attach to one of the spear arms from the Sanguinary Guard kit. If you don't have access to these bits, there are a ton to look at from the Mechanicum, Black Templar, and Space Wolves range, though a lot of these might take more or less cleanup to get looking Blood Angels-y. As you're picking the pose, try to keep in mind the weight of the weapon. You wouldn't hold an axe the same way you'd hold a spear, so try to pick an arm that makes the weapon feel like it has weight. Repose as necessary, then trim off the spearhead and replace with the axe head of your choice. Now the last details are the pauldrons. The main point here is to make sure that the chapter symbol is present on both. For my other two that I already kit bashed, I just went with Assault Intercessor pauldrons so that I had plenty of room for the decals, while sticking to the whole no decoration theme. I believe these particular ones are from the Black Templar Sword Brethren kit, if I remember correctly. But again, any blank pauldrons will work if you don't have these specific ones. And one last detail I added was this big old book from the Chaplain model, to reassert the Erelim's connection to the Reclusiasm. Now here's where we would move on to painting. If you're already familiar with me, you're probably into the more gritty, grimdark side of the hobby, and if that is the case, I already have a video on how I paint my black armor in my grimdark sponging style. For me though, I've recently been reapproaching how I paint my Blood Angels to give myself a more fulfilling paint experience, and it's going well so far. But I don't think I've quite got that recipe figured out yet, so I might have to hold off a little bit before sharing it with y'all. So until I get that recipe tutorial ready, why don't I go ahead and show you where it's at now, and show you how it looks like on this spookiest of Sanguinary Guard. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope this video gave you some ideas on how to kitbash your own sanguinary guard into some more flavorful units. I really enjoy this part of the hobby, finding individual, obscure little tidbits of lore and using them to open up a whole world of kitbashing opportunities. Until Death Company get a little bit better in 10th edition, I plan on running these guys as, well, Sanguinary Guard, and maybe I'll even attach Astreth to them as a captain proxy for the vibes. That does mean I have to paint him, though. Oops. But in any case, thank you so much for sticking around at the end of the video. I appreciate you picking my hobby corner to visit out of all of the other corners of this hobby. Feel free to drop a like and subscribe if you want to keep up to date with all that Gone Hella Minis has to offer. Comment to let me know what I should kitbash next, and until we meet again, be safe, be kind, and don't you dare go hollow.